This week you had a bunch of videos to watch, and one of the videos was kind of an overview of the next 4 weeks. The big idea of what the 4 big theoretical perspectives we're going to be looking at are. And they're information processing, social cognitive theory, social constructivism, and situated cognition. And in that video, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, it goes through and kind of gives some background information about the different theories, the different perspectives. But before we kind of go on, and today we talk about information processing a little more, I want to do our first poll, which asks which of these you are most familiar with. So I'm going to launch it. And it asks you to say which, between information processing, social cognitive theory, social constructivism, and situated cognition, you are most familiar with. And I think it would be great if given our fantastic number of attendees today, if even our organizers could answer the poll. Oh, it won't let me answer the poll.
Yeah, it won't let us answer. Sorry, Chris.
That's okay. It won't tell me who. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So for one person, it was social cognitive theory, and for the other, it was social constructivism. And if I were voting, I would have said that the one I'm most familiar with. Even though I've spent a lot of time with social constructivism, I think I'm most familiar with information processing. It comes the most naturally to me because of my background in neuroscience. Sarah, which one would you have picked as the one you're most familiar with?
I would also pick information processing. Yeah, it's again most related to my psychology background and the perspective I use primarily in my research.
And Pam, which one of those 4 theories are you most familiar with?
I would have chosen social constructivism. Just, I'm not sure why.
You know, I think that people who have done a certification in the last 10 years, in elementary for sure, probably are most familiar with social constructivism. It's, I think, it's been a very popular theory, which it's a great theory, so that's not a negative statement at all. And people who do science also who certify in science also probably got a lot of social constructivism in school because of the tie in with inquiry. Interesting, nobody picked situated cognition, which I would have to admit before I went back to work on my before I went to Wisconsin to work on degrees after having certified, I had no idea what situated cognition was. I wouldn't have recognized that term. So, and Sandy says constructivism was what we focused on for my master's. Yep. It's a huge area right now, and in fact, when I went back to get an additional degree, my interest was actually in specifically studying constructivism and constructivist learning. So in 2 weeks, we'll talk about constructivism, and hopefully we'll be able to kind of spend some time thinking about how it really applies to science and how constructivism and literacy in science especially work well together. But this week, our focus is information processing. So I put this slide in here because I know that when people come on Tuesdays, sometimes they've watched the lectures, sometimes they haven't. But this is just a reminder. If you haven't watched the YouTube video about information processing, you definitely still need to go and watch that because I'm not going to go over all of it. But a reminder of that two-store memory model and the idea that we have all this different input in the world that comes in through our sensory register. A lot of that gets lost because we can't pay attention to everything. What we attend to comes into our working memory, Some of that is lost, but some of it goes through a processing and coding stage that puts it into long-term memory. And this arrow is double-ended because once something's in working memory, we often are actually working with new information and old information at the same time as we do that processing and encoding. And as we talk about some of the strategies used there, that piece is really important, that understanding that we're always relating back to things that are in our long-term memory, that we rely on the long-term memory when we are when we're looking at that. And then the second half of this week talks more about the central executive and the control processes, specifically the idea of metacognition. And so today in the discussion time, what I want to do is I want to talk about some key strategies for processing and coding, and have each of us kind of talk about the examples that we can think of from our classroom of how we do that, or from our personal learning environments, of how we process and how we encode and what works best. Because I know that one of the best things we can all take away from this course is kind of that toolbox, that list of strategies, that list of information that can help us. So that's kind of what I want to do today for the first part. And then we'll talk a little bit more about metacognition and think a little bit about some of the factors and the strategies of metacognition. So this is just that reminder slide. So the first guiding question for reflection is, what strategies for elaboration, organization, meaningfulness, and metacognition do you find most effective either as a learner or as a teacher? So that's the one we're kind of going to focus on. We'll come around and talk about the second reflection question too at the end, but I want to focus on this because I think sharing our experiences is really powerful. So the first one, strategies for elaboration. When you think of things you do in your classroom or things you do for yourself that are elaboration strategies, when you're taking in new information and you're intentionally elaborating on it in order to transfer it to long-term memory, what types of strategies do you think of or do you use? Sandy and Stacey, I bet with just the few of us here, we could unmute ourselves and probably talk. I don't think that there's too much static. Let's see if both of you unmute yourselves, if we can have a conversation without.
I'm getting the message that I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, I
I
can
can
hear you.
barely hear you.
Okay. Okay, let me turn up my volume.
Ooh,
Is that a little better?
Yes.
that's perfect.
Great. I just submitted that I use cooperative learning groups. My students sit in groups of 3 or 4, and when I'm initiating new content, I always make time for small group discussions and then have the groups record collective ideas to submit for class discussion. So I'm a talker, and I throw that at my kids for talking too.
I like that.
I try to have my students use the phrase, I have a connection. I have students sit in partners and think, pair, share quite a bit.
I like that. I think that a lot of times when we, either when we elaborate or we help students to elaborate, we definitely use verbal elaboration a lot. I think that is what comes most natural to us most naturally to us in our society, that we kind of have this talking through things that happens. For students that aren't verbal, are there other types of elaboration they can do?
I'll raise my hand before I speak, but in my experience with language learners, I tended to have kids spend some time making a personal icon with when we were acquiring, like, say, new vocabulary. Simple kind of, just a um, app icon kind of idea for to represent the idea so that they had a visual as well. But most of those icons, most of that, those kind of simpler ideas came after they had a chance to talk to their groups about their understanding of the concept.
I like that. One of the things I like to do is to make them represent it, to allow them to talk to each other, but then to make them both draw and write their understanding, because the process of doing it in those multiple forms seems to really force them to elaborate and force them to think through more more different ways of looking at things.
This is Pam. I tend to use a lot of kinesthetic stuff because I teach little kids, so it seems to be really helpful to be able to, do a pegging kind of thing, peg certain concepts to a certain part of our body, or sing a song or do a dance to help them elaborate.
This is Sandy. I agree. I find that singing and dancing and kind of helps them connect that. And I even have students who come back years later and sing some of the songs about, the different types of rocks. And it's amazing that here they are in sophomores in high school and they're still singing the songs.
Yeah, this is Sarah, everyone, and I think a lot of you hit on a really important point about the elaboration as well. Is we're trying to help students to do something, to elaborate in a way that is going to help them remember or to store that information effectively in long-term memory, because that's really the focus of the model that we've been talking about today.
One thing that I think I haven't heard the term yet, but that ties in well with elaboration and goes with both with these ideas that we've kind of come around to, is the idea of mnemonics. I can talk. And the different ways that people help kids to memorize the order of the planets in the solar system, or any of the other things that we're looking at memorizing or having students memorize. All of those different tools that we give them that are not necessarily related to meaning, but it's an opportunity to think more kind of and elaborate around and build up sense making. Those are all elaborations as well. Okay, I'm going to move to the next one, and if people come up, and Bonnie and Gay, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to ask you guys to mute yourselves. I just unmuted you, and there's a little green, there should be an orange arrow, and below that a little green microphone. And if you click on that, it mutes you, and then you can mute and unmute yourself as we go. And you're welcome to raise your hand and type in questions and all of that. So I'm going to move to the next one. If people want to kind of chime back in on things that they think of for elaboration as we talk, you're welcome to do that. The next strategy that we use when we're encoding is organization. So when you think about this, and I want to just say that we use this so much in science. This is one of the most powerful things that we use in science for helping students to take in new content and helping them to encode information. But what are some strategies for organization that we use in our classrooms?
Hi, this is Stacy. I'll just chime in with notebooks are a central focus for all my classes, and so having students record thoughts and ideas in their lab notebooks is really um, the the main method I use to help kids organize. And it brings to one of my biggest questions is how much am I forcing my own personal linear organization schemes on my students when I model for them how to acquire and record new information.
Oh, so that's an interesting question. So how much is it that we are giving them our organization instead of having them create their own organization? And I think, I think about a bunch of the different lesson plans that I've seen out there for things that are about the inherent organization in science, like the periodic table or the classification system, or there's a whole bunch of them. And there's so many lesson plans that people write actually that kind of, they must be working at that same question of if I let the students organize it themselves before I teach them the canon, teach them how the scientists organize it, then what happens? And does that help them? And I think that's a really powerful thing, to let them organize it themselves first.
I think when the students are able to organize effectively, they acquire and retain information. But when they really struggle with organization and that foundation is not really one of their strengths, it almost impedes their ability to access the information. And so I find myself laying out how information should be organized as they record it. And sometimes I feel like I'm spoon feeding them. But when I have students, especially struggling students, who just have no organization at all, it's that catch-22. If I allow them to struggle with how to organize it, then they miss the content. And if I don't allow them to struggle with the organization, they miss the content.
Yeah. So one of the things that we use sometimes kind of across all content areas for organization are graphic organizers. And I wonder, when you're working with students who struggle with organization, if you train them to use a graphic organizer, are they able to use that as a tool to try and help them to get closer to that point of making meaning of the organizational structure?
That's my goal, and I try, but I find myself, I'm a real linear person, so I find graphic organizers that are very linear, and then I feel that I'm doing a disservice to students who might want to work more in a mind map format or figure out their own format. I spend a lot of time picking the ones that work for me, and I don't have a big repertoire of choices for students. So I'll be interested to see what other people are using in terms of graphic organizers, especially, so I can give students at least the option to organize it that way.
Sandy, I see that you have your hand up, but you know what, Stacey, I'm going to add that to the sharing resources. We already have the one up there for rubrics. Sorry, my brain and I are not friends today. We already have the one up there for rubrics, but we can add one for graphic organizers and encourage people to share their favorite graphic organizers to use for kids at all different grade levels, so that we can all kind of pull those off. And I have some that I really like that I'll put up as well. Sandy?
Stacy, I think it's great that you teach them a way to do that, because even though it's always the same way, it can be really comforting for kids to get that. I agree. I teach them very linear, but then on a bulletin board, I teach fourth grade. So on a bulletin board, then I use a different graphic organizer, more of a concept map, and they add to it. So they see different ways, and I'm hoping that will help other kids.
Sandy, that goes along with what I was going to say as well, is that once you have a repertoire of a bunch of different types, if you give them some initial instruction on each of the types that are available to them, and then let them pick their own, let them work in groups, share with each other which one made the most sense to them, there then are opportunities for them to pick which one works, or to share with each other why they like a specific one. Obviously, you can't do that every time because it takes time, but across an entire year, you can definitely have them teach each other a little bit. Okay, so I think that with strategies for organization, and this is something that came up, but I do really want to call attention to it, is that we can talk about strategies for organization across all content areas. A lot of graphic organizers could work for everything from vocabulary to, a scientific model and demonstrating understanding of that. And then there are some types of organization that really work best for science, and that are more about that part where we're trying to organize our understanding of the world around us. It isn't necessarily just a graphic organizer. And so I would just encourage you to kind of reflect on that and to think about, when you're learning science, kind of how much of that time is spent organizing the world into patterns and cause and effect and cycles and all of those different things that are part of helping us understand science, and kind of what role that plays then in information processing and metacognition specific to science. So, okay, the third one is meaningfulness. And I know that earlier somebody talked about saying I have a connection, and that's a great strategy for both elaboration and for meaningfulness, that process of making meaning and making connections to our lives. Are there other strategies that we use for meaningfulness?
Well, I think one, and I didn't see anyone with their hand raised, so I'll jump in a little bit. But I mean, for meaningfulness, even just talking basically about, what is the purpose behind this, or why are we doing this, or even, relating to the Common Core. Chris, I know you and I have had discussions about, do we talk about what the Common Core is with our students, and, why we're using it, what it is, and what our goals are, and even what we're working on for the day. And then obviously how is this useful for me? How will I use it again in the future? What's the point? Why are we focusing on or learning this?
I like that. I think that's a great connection to meaningfulness to tie to the future. I know that when I taught physics to high school students, I worked really hard to make meaning by providing students opportunities to tie it to things that they cared about, which may or may not seem meaningful to me. So when we had to do projectile motion, we always tied it back to sports. And if you have a kickoff and it needs to go this far, and this is the angle you kick it at, what does the speed need to be? Or why do we need to make the ramps on highways as long as we do, in terms of speeding up and slowing down, getting to highway speed safely, being able to merge on, doing some stuff like that. Or things like when we were studying waves and reflection and all of that, to make sure that we tied it into wearing glasses, and or also with waves, making sure to tie it into music and the different types of sounds. And, you know, I mean, on some level, those are inherent within the science, and on some level those are surface connections, but it makes meaning within their lives, which generates that interest and allows them to tie into other information that would be in their long-term memory. So Gay typed in a comment that in this, we can model or show students the target so that they begin to understand why they're about to study something. And again, that's along those same lines. That's so important, that it's not just kind of disconnected random information, tying units together, showing them their end goal, previewing lessons, things like that. Thank you, Gay.
This is Pam. I was just thinking of something with our expanded definition of text, going back to making those text connections. That really becomes really kind of exciting in science if we're going to make text to text and text to world and text to, you know, whatever else we're making connections. Just that expanded a definition of text kind of opens that way up to how we can have kiddos show the meaningfulness of what they're doing.
Definitely. My children are small still. I am so excited. One of them starts middle school this year, and he's like a real person and stuff, although that means he's moody, which gotta love him. But we have such a large collection on our shelves of books that I've bought used and at secondhand stores about volcanoes and earthquakes and bugs and, you know, whatever little thing that they might have shown interest in, that I could find a book or a magazine or even something I could print off of the internet for them to look at, to be able to help them to make meaning by having those extended connections that they rely on text and all the different types of text. Gay also typed in SQR3 space A, which I know a little bit about SQR3, but I don't know a huge amount about that. So maybe somebody else whose microphone is working can explain it, or they can type more in. Sandy, thank you. We love dogs, but thank you for typing your question in instead of unmuting, because sometimes dogs are loud. So Sandy says, linking to children's previous experiences, relating to concepts in their lives that sparks their interest in providing hands-on learning. And Sandy, with that, I want to make a really explicit tie to the idea of place-based learning. And in our state, we talk a lot about place-based learning. And it's so essential that we understand that place-based learning is not just a feel-good thing. Place-based learning is a strategy for meaningfulness. If I live in an area where it is possible to find a dinosaur bone out in my farm when I'm herding cattle, I probably really want to make sure when I talk about whether it's anatomical structures or I talk about the layers of the earth and how finding things in the different layers of the earth gives us information about time, or if it's about dinosaurs itself, or it's about classification, whatever it is, I really better link back to that, because that's something that kids are experiencing. Or if I work in a farming community and I'm teaching about life cycles, I'm really silly if I don't tie back into that place-based thing that kids are experiencing at home. So I think that's really great.
Hi, Chris. This is Gay. Can you hear me now?
Great. I can hear you. Welcome.
I had to unlock my control panel. So finally.
So survey question, read, recite, review is what SQR3 stands for.
Yes, and I used to use that when I taught science from 75 to 2008. have the kids survey their chapter and to question anything they, like headings, subheadings, read the questions over at the end of the chapter, read actually, and I ask them to always do some metacognition. In other words, they'd read a paragraph. I'd ask them, once they've read it, they stop and remember what they read, or while they're reading, if they catch themselves thinking about something else, stop, go back to the beginning of the paragraph, reread. I had them start reading like for 5 minutes and then increase that up to about 15 before they took a break. I encouraged them to take breaks. And then to think about, kind of recite to themselves what they read about, and be sure to go back and review within 24 hours. So that's what I meant by SQ3R.
Yes. Thank you, Gay. I knew that I had read, SQ3R isn't one of the specific things I used, and I knew it was something I had learned about at some point, but I couldn't call it up. Or search Google, because we're looking at my screen, and that would have been funny to watch me do. So we're going to move on from here to talk about metacognitive strategies. But before we do that, because we're going to talk more about different types of metacognitive strategies and all of that, I have another poll that I want to put up. And this poll asks you to think about which type of information processing strategy you use most in your classroom. Of course, I hit post the poll and then I can't see it anymore until we're done with it. So sorry if I just butchered the end of that statement. So thinking about the things that we've just talked about, and I put metacognition up there as an option if you wanted to select that. But which of those do you use most in your classroom? It looks like we have 3 out of the 4 people have voted, and I don't know necessarily who. There we go. So I'm going to close the poll and show the results to you guys. So 50% said elaboration and 50% said organization, and that's really interesting to me because I think that if I had been able to answer, I would have picked meaningfulness as the one that I use most often, which is the one that nobody picked. And I don't know, Sarah and Pam, which ones would you have picked?
I would have picked meaningfulness as well.
I think I would have picked elaboration.
So that's interesting. That's a really nice kind of distribution with 7 people across the 3 strategies. And there's one poll, I actually want to go back to it because it's something really, I think, important for us to think about as teachers, to reflect on ourselves. So before we move on to metacognition, and if you get seasick, close your eyes because I'm going to go back a few slides. When we go back to this two-store dual memory model, and we think about the sensory register and that we have to pay attention to something to get it into our working memory, and we look at that, this piece right here of paying attention, it sounds really intentional, right? Like, well, I'm going to pay attention to that, and therefore it will go into my working memory. But in reality, it doesn't work quite so cleanly as that, and we all are a little bit predisposed to pay attention to different things. So I know that I personally am very easily influenced by the sense of smell. So I can be trying to really pay attention to you, and I can block out noises really well, I can block out sights really well, but I can't block out smells at all. They will overwhelm my capacity to pay attention to anything else. And so that would be, for me, the sense that I find that I attend to the most, not because I'm choosing to, but just because it kind of happens that way. So I want to put up a poll and ask you guys to say which of the 5 senses you find that happens the most with for you, that the things that you kind of naturally attend to, just because that's the way you're wired. Okay, so hopefully those results just shared with you. So 50% said sight, 75% said hearing, and I know that I've talked about this with both Sarah and Pam in the past, but what would be the one that you are most easily influenced by?
Well, for me, it would definitely be hearing. I get really distracted by other sounds that, even background noises.
That would be for me as well. And particularly repetitive noises really irritate me. So I know, like in my classroom, if somebody's tapping, I always have to ask them to stop tapping because I can't focus. So I'm thinking some of my other kiddos can't do that either.
So that's why I wanted to put this quiz up, because I know that that's such a common thing for people to say, that noises are such a huge impact on us. And if we go back to this idea that, hopefully you can see my screen again. If we go back to this idea that this is how we take in input from the outside, we kind of go through this process of getting it into long-term memory. If we're putting a block right here, and they can't even attend, it doesn't matter how much elaboration happens, it doesn't matter how much meaningfulness happens, because they're not going to even engage in that part, because they're not going to be able to even attend to what we are hoping that they'll attend to. So it's important to just be aware. It's important to be aware of that idea that that the environment can be such a big impact. So, and there's a bunch of comments that have come through, but yes, the main idea of these comments is that it would be interesting to ask our students this, and to think about this as we organize our classroom, and to make sure that we're not so overwhelming. And Sandy made a point about visual stimuli. So visual and auditory stimuli are a big deal, and those are the two, other than me, who I know I'm super weird, but those are the two most common that people are easily distracted by: sight and sound. So, okay, we're going to go back to metacognition. So in the last of the videos for this week about metacognition, Sarah goes through and presents a bunch of information, which is fantastic. And one of the things that she talks about is that there are 3 values that influence metacognition. One is the task and how we perceive the task. One is the strategy itself, knowing what strategy to use and when and why to use them. And then another is the person or learner strategy, or the person or learner factor, and kind of understanding our own capabilities. So, thinking about these and thinking about metacognition kind of more generally, and actually, just in case anybody hasn't looked at the videos yet, does anybody want to give us a working definition of metacognition for the day? And then, Stacy, I see that you have your hand up. We'll get to that in just a second, unless that is a working definition of metacognition.
Well, I can definitely give one. So the idea of, I mean, at its very basic level, it's thinking about our thinking, right? Or reflecting on our cognitive processes. So what do we know? What don't we know? What strategies are we using? Are strategies for learning effective or not? How might we need to change what we're doing? Things like that.
Excellent. Okay, so Stacy.
Yes, I'm here.
You just had your hand up, so I didn't know.
Oh no, it's okay.
It's been for a while.
I typed in a question a while ago referring to, it was the poll about what we use the most in our classroom.
Oh, yeah.
And I obviously chose elaboration, but one of the things that I would really like as a personal goal to incorporate into my classroom is metacognition and the strategies. How do I implement, what are some everyday strategies to teach students so that they can do that, have a self-check, that so it's just initiated on their own. And I was just wondering where people go to find those strategies, or what are other people doing to incorporate metacognition, because I saw none of us chose metacognition as what we do most in our classroom.
Yeah, that was partly my fault because we didn't talk about it, and so after just talking about and elaborating on the other three, you were primed to pick those. But that's a great question that leads right into this slide. So I would say that when we think about those strategies, we would want to, for any metacognitive strategy that we're going to talk about, we would want to kind of identify when and why you would use it. And that's kind of, I think part of it is that we just talk about metacognition. And Sarah, I love that when you gave your working definition, you talked not just about knowing what we know, but also kind of understanding what we're doing, that there's this broader piece to it besides just kind of a self-survey of, do I get it? So let's actually start with task. What are strategies that we can use in the classroom that help students to use metacognition to kind of have a sense of what they even understand their task to be, what they're supposed to be doing, what they're supposed to be learning. What are ways that we can help students with that specifically? So I'll give one. One of the things that we're going to talk about next week a lot is modeling. And so getting a sense of helping students to get a sense of understanding the task, perceiving the task, being able to articulate whether they understand what they're supposed to be doing, is actually to provide them some examples with modeling, and then let them kind of reiterate what they're supposed to do, put directions into their own words, restate the end goal. That gives both you and the student, a sense of whether or not they're on track with even understanding the task they've been asked to do, which is a really important part of being metacognitive, not just understanding what you know, but understanding what you're doing.
I know in my classroom I put up, like if I have the objectives for a certain, say in math, and I write the objective up, I have the kids read through it together out loud, and then we go back and we say, do we understand all the words? Do we understand the vocabulary of what I even ask them to do? And then, turn and talk. Do you know what you're supposed to do? What is it that you're supposed to do here?
For me, sometimes when I start a project, I do something similar, but I will, give the rubric, give directions, and then let students break out and get supplies or get started. And then after 5 minutes, I'll call them back as a class and ask them, do I need to prioritize? Meaning, do you need help understanding where to start and what the progression of steps would be?
I see that something that Sandy typed into the questions was having students think out loud. And I think that can be really important for facilitating metacognition, thinking about the task, but even, in general. Just because oftentimes we don't think about what sorts of processes we're using as we work towards a goal, and having to verbalize them really brings them to the forefront to allow us to reflect on them.
Stacy?
Yes, I'm here.
I just saw your hand up again.
Oh, I think I have it down. I don't know. Is that down?
It's down now, yep.
Oh, well, it shows on my screen the arrow is pointing up, so I'm like, well,
right.
Obviously
yes.
That's up, and yeah, it's kind of like the mute and mute. Sorry,
yep.
My bad,
it's
everybody.
Okay. You're fine. You're fine.
When my hand's down, you can call on me.
So, yeah, I think all of those are great. Yes, having students think out loud and having check-ins, I think, is really important. I want to skip down to person and learner. What are some ways that we can help students to be metacognitive about their own capabilities, their own needs? And I think maybe, Sandy, what you just said about kind of where should I prioritize is part of that. But what else is there that we can do to help students to be metacognitive about their own capabilities?
I think one thing we could do, and I'm thinking, I know we could do this in science, but I'm thinking particularly in math, is to be able to say, if we were introducing a new concept, a student could even write down, what could I teach someone else about this, and what would I want someone else to teach me about this, so that they would be thinking about, what do I know, what don't I know, would kind of give them a good idea of where they need to go with their learning on that particular concept.
Yeah. Sarah always has a good example about this one, about learning names.
Oh, yes.
Not to put you on the spot.
No, that's fine. I mean, yeah, and I guess this is just something, part of it helping people to figure out their capabilities is, what through experience have you found that you've struggled with? So, I mean, something that I know that I struggle with in my classes is learning people's names. And so I've come up, there's a variety of strategies you can use to learn names. What I found works best for me is actually having my students wear name tags so that I can look at their face and their name at the same time for the first few classes, and that helps me. So I guess in terms of metacognition, I identified something that I don't do so well and came up with a strategy that works for me to address that. For other people, that might not be the best way to learn names. I have colleagues who use different methods, but that's what works for me.
Yeah, I always made them email me a picture. When I had 160 students in one room, I made them email me a picture and made a little chart, because I knew that I do really well with organization and not so well with remembered names. So that helps. But I think that's a great example of that. As our students become more aware of what they're really good at and what their strengths are, they're able to build around that. And they're able to be metacognitive about modifying their own environment to make things work better for them. Which leads nicely to the idea of the value of strategy and awareness of strategies that we can use and when and why we would use them. So I think a lot of times we do see students who kind of learn a strategy and want to use it all the time. And there are settings that aren't great for every strategy. And so I want to move on. There's one more slide here, but as we think about different strategies, I think it's always really important to be explicit with our students about that. And actually, I think that's a really key thing. And I had a poll about that, but we're going to skip it for time. So the last slide here is actually about what the metacognitive strategy types are. So there's goal setting or planning, where you're deciding upon the goal and determining how to reach the goal. There's monitoring, where you're checking on how well the planned strategies are working. There's affecting, using what you've learned while you're monitoring to change the strategies if they're needed. And then evaluating or examining your learning outcomes to determine the effectiveness of the strategies used. And any of those strategy types could be used in a lot of different settings. And we've talked about a lot of different strategy types that kind of fit into each of those. We talked about different goal setting strategies, different monitoring strategies, different evaluating strategies. We may not have talked about affecting strategies, but as we talked about those different factors that affect metacognition, we've really addressed these strategies. And the question that I had a poll that I don't think got added in, I think that it got missed when the polls got put in, was to ask which of these is most important. which of these is most important when it comes to the idea of explicitly teaching our students how to do something, explicitly teaching them how to be metacognitive? Which of these do you think is most important for us to focus on as we do that? So Stacy says goals, that the most important is the goal setting or planning one, that we really need to explicitly teach them how to decide upon a goal and figure out how to reach a goal. What do other people think?
Oh,
And then there's one cow that when I went up to get the other, she ran.
So Bonnie says goals and evaluating. And then Sandy, your fourth grader said goal setting. So does that mean you asked them this question? And they said goal
yes,
setting?
they had a My Voice survey, and that was one of their most difficult parts this year, that they said was setting goals was difficult for them.
Interesting.
I found this year with my students, sometimes they would come back after we'd spent 2 or 3 days working on a project or something, and they had been working towards a completely different goal. And, that was really frustrating for them and for me. And so, in terms of monitoring, just stopping and checking in with them multiple times. How is this going to help you reach your goal? And a lot of times students don't even know what the goal is. They're just going through the motions.
Stacey, I agree. I think that sometimes monitoring becomes an issue because we haven't, or because students haven't articulated well enough for themselves their goal. I mean, I do that in my life all the time. I can't really, I moved here over 2 years ago, and I still have an entire room full of boxes in my house because I have not determined a goal and have not made a plan for reaching it. So periodically I monitor whether or not the pile of boxes is decreasing, and of course it's not, because I didn't ever set a goal. I didn't ever articulate that, and so I can't I can't effectively do the monitoring or the affecting or the evaluating because I never stopped and set a goal and planned for it. And so I think that's really crucial, and I'm glad that a lot of people said that the goals are important. And we're at an hour, and so I don't want to keep people late, but I do want to say this, that I see one of the really fantastic things that we are going to be able to tie back into this is in 2 weeks when we get to the idea of scaffolding, and as we talk about scaffolding, really being explicit about how we scaffold the goal setting, the monitoring, the affecting, and the evaluating into our activities, and not have metacognition be something separate. Not that metacognitive strategies can't be their own thing, but we really want to build these strategies into the supports we're providing in the classroom so that we can provide those supports in the context of activities, and maybe raise people that are a little bit better than me at figuring out how to unpack their boxes, in a timely fashion, not 2 years later. So that said, if people still have questions, that's great. We can keep talking. Otherwise, I want to let those of you who have somewhere to be to head out. Since